Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining, for being interested in my doctoral dissertation. As any PhD, this has been a long project with a lot of time investment, and so I'm very happy to share my journey and share my learnings with anyone who might be interested. Bit of background context about my PhD. I took the decision in 2019 to pursue a doctorate. I was working at KPMG at the time as a manager in consulting. Of course, people thought I was a little crazy to do something like this when the job of consulting is already like two full-time jobs. But personally, I didn't feel completely satisfied with the work of consulting because it's very fast-paced, and so necessarily it always remains a bit superficial because you just don't have the time to go really in-depth into a topic and ask yourself more fundamental questions. And that was important to me. So I had a discussion with my boss at the time and explained that I wanted to do a PhD to go deep and slow. Exactly the opposite of what consulting work typically is. And of course, I needed to choose a topic that I felt very passionate about to avoid that I would lose interest after some time. This was 2019, so AI was already a big thing, not like today, because it was not yet as accessible to the general public. But in the business community, there was already a lot of hype around AI, mostly about predictive machine learning and advanced analytics. And there was already this question of what AI would mean for human employment, whether it would replace human workers through automation or augment them. And in the business community, the common position was that augmentation was the most desirable path and the most likely scenario because anyways, artificial and human intelligence were very complementary. I always felt that this was a bit simple as an answer, and there was no real discussion on what it takes actually to reach this augmentation scenario in a company, for example. And so I decided to make this my PhD topic, to move underneath the surface of AI-based augmentation and the management of it. I contacted many different universities and professors in the wider region around Luxembourg who were specializing in this type of research. But when you work full time and you are completely new to this research world, you're not really taken seriously, right? And I did not find anyone who was willing to take me on as a PhD. So I started a DBA program instead in Grenoble. This was the end of 2019. So DBA, for those who don't know, it's a doctoral program focused on research, but like in an MBA, it's targeted to managers who work full-time. So you get classes in the evenings, weekends, a few intensive weeks per year. You get a research supervisor, you have regular deadlines to make progress, so it's a lot more structured than an academic PhD. And of course, you pay for all of this. So this was a great way to get started. I learned a lot from these courses and from my cohort, but after a while I realized that the expectations I had for myself and for the quality of my research were a bit higher than what was necessarily expected in a DBA program. And so I decided to change to a real academic PhD after 2 years. And now that I had already started a bit of my research and I was already part a bit of this community, it was easier to be taken seriously. And I managed to join the VU in Amsterdam as an external PhD. And that's one of the departments that's most famous in Europe and the world for research on this topic of managing AI and AI's implications for human work. I'm telling you all of this because for people who are interested in pursuing a professional PhD, it's useful to know a bit the different options that you have and the challenges that could be faced to understand also why it can take so long to get really started with the research. So now let's go into the research itself. In the beginning of the PhD, you start by reading a lot of articles, literature, to understand what is already known about your topic and what the current conversation is in academia to which you want to contribute with your research. And this literature review, it also helps you to find your research community. And this is very important. So my community and the perspective I joined in my research was that of the information systems discipline, which is very much at the intersection of management, computer science, and social studies. And it focuses on studying how information technologies are shaped by and shape human practices within organizations. And the way technology is understood in this field is that it's not deterministic, which means that you cannot predict exactly the effects that will come from these technologies because they are so highly dependent on the context. They depend not only on what the technology is theoretically able to do, but also, and even mostly, I'd say, on how the humans in the specific context use the technology and organize themselves around it. So technologies here are not seen just as tools that are used passively to implement some human decisions, but they actively shape also human decisions. They shape how human actions, they shape how humans work, how they collaborate, etc. So this perspective helps explain why technologies, once they are introduced in an organization, often come with consequences that were not so expected at the beginning. And this perspective really appealed to me because I always found that in the debates around AI and employment, for instance, we ask too much the question, what will happen based on what the technology can do, and not so much, what do we want to happen and how do we make it work, make this work in our context. Then, when you do a PhD, you need to explain, of course, why you are studying your topic. And it's not enough that there's a lot of interest on it in the business community or general society, but there needs to be a theoretical interest as well. Why is the management of AI theoretically different from other technologies? And what makes AI qualitatively different from other technologies? And there has been quite a bit of publications on this in the past years, but when I started this PhD, not so much yet. So one good way now to summarize what makes AI different and theoretically interesting is the combination of its autonomy, learning capacity, and inscrutability. So autonomy meaning that AI, compared to other technologies, it is more autonomous because rather than only having rules that need to be explicitly programmed by humans, it derives its rules, its processes, its outputs from patterns in data. It's also learning and self-improving continuously from new data, from new experience, also data that has not been pre-processed or structured by humans. And it's increasingly inscrutable. So AI outputs and processes, they are not just opaque or impossible to understand for the general public, but increasingly also for experts. And this is also what makes it unique. Now, what does this mean for the management of AI then? Why is managing AI different? Well, this is what my dissertation has focused on and contributed to, but I did not start from zero here. There's already literature both on managing with AI and managing AI itself. Managing with AI is about managers using AI for their managerial work, either strategic work like strategic analysis, foresight, decision making, or using AI to manage people. We know this well from companies like Uber or Amazon, but it has become more common now that AI is used for allocating tasks, evaluating performance, providing incentives, monitoring the satisfaction of workers, and so on. So this is not what my research is about. I focused on studying managing AI itself. And there's been a little bit of research on this, mostly in the field of strategy. And here it's all about seeing the management of AI through strategic frameworks, where you need to define your business objectives that you pursue with AI, you identify relevant use cases, you identify the different organizational capabilities that you need to make this happen, data, models, infrastructure, skills, etc. A bit like ingredients in a cooking recipe. And then you elaborate the recipe, a roadmap, a timeline for establishing and building these capabilities and gradually making progress on your use cases and reaching your business objectives. But in my research, I wondered what happens after the strategy and the implementation plan, and what does management of AI actually look like on a daily basis? So really moving underneath the surface of what AI management is. The overall research question I therefore had was, how do organizations manage AI through multidisciplinary practices, and with what consequences? And I understand management here not as an organizational function, but as Peter Drucker defined it, as a practice that enables groups of people to work together towards common goals. And this practice is not only accomplished by formal managers, but by everyone that bears responsibility for contribution to working towards these common goals. And this is why I place an emphasis in my research question on multidisciplinarity. And throughout my research, I considered the practices not just of managers, but also of AI developers, users, and support staff in how they contributed to managing AI. To address this question, I conducted 3 independent studies within my PhD, as it's very common to do, and this over 5 years approximately. In my first study, I unpacked the concept of augmentation. That's often described as the managerial ambition to pursue with AI. And while augmentation has been broadly described as a complementary combination of human and artificial intelligence to create a whole that is more than the sum of its individual parts, no one had yet asked the question, more of what do we actually want to create, or what is augmented then with AI? So in this study, I asked this question. I addressed it by conducting an in-depth literature review based on all of the literature I found on AI-based augmentation since the 1950s already, covering 5 different disciplines: computer science, information systems, economics, labor economics mostly, strategic management, and philosophy. And by analyzing all of this literature and coding the contents of this research, I was able to identify some common themes, common narratives on what AI is supposed to augment. AI can augment human abilities, human body and human brain, either temporarily or lastingly. AI can augment intelligence, meaning enable better knowledge and decision making in an organization. AI can augment work practices and opportunities, and AI can augment business performance. So augmentation doesn't mean the same thing to different people. And I also found in this study that there are many interrelations between these four types of augmentation. There are dependencies. For example, if you want to augment intelligence in an organization, so the general decision-making capability, let's say, you also need to augment the intelligence of your human workers, so augmenting human abilities. There are also some tensions. For example, focusing on augmenting business performance, like the value for customers or the efficiency of your processes, might be contrary to augmenting the satisfaction or the meaning that your workers associate with their work. And there are examples of this. And then there are these accelerating effects when you combine different types of augmentations together. I also found that depending on the narrative, the type of augmentation that is pursued, humans and AI are not understood in the same way, and they can be configured or combined in different ways. In augmenting human abilities, AI is very much understood as having superior capabilities to us limited human beings, and it's all about embedding these capabilities physically or more indirectly in our bodies, our brains, but therefore being quite dependent on the AI to have these superior capabilities. Augmenting intelligence is much more about humans and AI being distinct, but continuously learning from each other. So one teaching the other through mutual learning loops, and thereby creating this notion of hybrid intelligence in an organization that's superior in itself, always through the combination of humans and AI. Augmenting work is very much about taking individual work tasks and distributing them between human workers and between AI agents, depending on their respective strengths. But here, AI is also augmenting the work tasks because it's creating new opportunities for new markets, new services where humans then can also have jobs. And it's also assisting, AI is also assisting humans as tools. So it's not just humans versus AI agents, but it's also humans versus humans with AI tools. And in augmenting business performance, it's more about measuring how AI is contributing business value through productivity and through innovation. And on the other hand, the same for humans, and continuously comparing performance on both sides. So now taking a step back from the detailed findings of this first study, how did this contribute to my doctoral dissertation and my overall research question? Well, it showed that the management of AI depends very much on the objectives that are pursued within the organizations and the interdependencies between them, and what this means for the underlying configuration of humans and AI in the workplace. AI objectives should therefore not be treated superficially by just saying we will augment and not automate, but it really requires deep thought on what you want to achieve with AI and how this relates to other elements. While my first study was a literature review, the other two were empirical research based on new data that I collected in the field. As I said, I was working as a consultant when I started this PhD, but shortly afterwards I changed to work for ADEM, the Public Employment Service in Luxembourg. Not only because this work was more compatible with pursuing a PhD on the side, but also because, as you know from my choice of PhD topic, I'm very passionate about topics of employment and skills and how AI is impacting those. So it was fantastic to be able to work in an organization that's closest to these topics. I was also fortunate to arrive at ADEM, at a time when there was willingness to invest in AI internally. And as I was nominated as data and statistics manager at ADEM, I was able to build this AI and data science activity from the ground up and also conduct research on it. And this is a bit an unusual research method, as you can imagine, because the traditional view of research is that the researcher needs to be very detached from the field itself and remain as objective and neutral as possible. But more recently, at least in social studies, the view on this has started to shift and recognize that the researcher always comes with an influence and with their own interpretations. They are never neutral. And it's better to be aware of this and to make it fully transparent. So this shift has created room for new methods like autoethnography, which is what I ended up doing. So for those of you not familiar with research so much, ethnographic research is a qualitative method where you as a researcher are embedded for a long time, several years usually, in the field that you study, and you observe mainly just what happens very openly. You document everything. So you start out the research in the field just with a general topic of interest because you need to focus a little bit, but you don't have any hypothesis that you want to confirm, like in traditional or quantitative research. So it's very open and you end up with huge amounts of qualitative data. In my case, over 200 meeting hours, over 200 documents. And then you need to structure, you need to code the contents, the lines within those transcripts and documents. You analyze, and based on this, you identify things, stories that are happening and that are interesting for theory. And that will maybe help develop new theories that can then be tested and confirmed by more quantitative methods, for example. So this is what ethnography is. Autoethnography is a sub-method where you as a researcher are also an active participant and not just an observer in the field. So you analyze not just external observations, but also dialogues, documents, practices in which you were personally involved. And this requires extremely high discipline to combine your work as a practitioner with that of a researcher. You need to document everything, not just what is being said, but also by whom, and especially if it comes from you and how it might influence things. And when you analyze, you need to be very careful with your own interpretations because those might be very biased. So in my case, I worked with my two supervisors, my two professors on those research projects to reach the necessary analytical distance, as it might be called in academia. So I conducted two different empirical studies on two different but related projects within ADEM. The first one was a multi-year project where we designed, developed, and partly implemented a quite comprehensive AI workflow that was meant to extract data, structured data on skills from CVs and from job ads to identify in detail what skills were mentioned on both sides. On the one hand, to analyze trends in the labor market, but also to use this skills data to calculate and matches between individual job seekers and job ads. The second was a shorter one-year project to develop and test a machine learning model that could predict the risk that a job seeker registering at ADEM could end up becoming long-term unemployed, which means unemployed for over 1 year. And this was in an effort to use these predictions of risk to propose more intensive or targeted support to those job seekers with a higher risk. So as you can see, both projects are really based on traditional AI, machine learning, natural language processing, etc. They started before generative AI and agentic AI became widespread. And so my research focus has also been on traditional AI, And towards the end, then I started to regularly interpret how my findings would apply with regards to generative AI as well, but it wasn't my main focus. Let's go into the findings of those two studies. In one study, I focused on the phenomenon of fuzziness in AI. What I call fuzziness here is the shift from binary rule-based logic in algorithms, so 1 or 0 or specific categories, to a more probabilistic, fluid, data-driven reasoning. So like in fuzzy logic, but going beyond that. So we know that in AI, often the outputs, they are not black and white. They need to be interpreted further by humans in order, or by other technological systems, in order to be used as outputs. And we know that fuzzy reasoning techniques enable AI to mimic human decision-making to some extent. So they help mimicking qualitative way of reasoning of humans. They help mimic dealing with ambiguity. So when someone expresses themselves in a vague way or not giving all of the information, and also uncertainty. This fuzzy reasoning, one concrete case, for example, is in the matching of job seekers with open jobs that I observed therefore at ADEM, where AI and the fuzzy reasoning that comes with it, it enables what we call fuzzy matching, to find the pairs, the matches between job seekers and jobs that are not the most obvious, but that are more indirect and more far-fetched, maybe more creative matches, but that are still very important to find. And the question I asked was how this fuzziness in AI systems manifests across organizational levels and practices, and how different organizational actors cope with such fuzziness. I found that these facets that distinguish AI technology, I talked about them in the beginning of my presentation. So autonomy, learning capacity, inscrutability, what makes AI really unique, that this is what directly enables fuzzy reasoning in AI-based decision-making. And this leads to new affordances or possibilities for an organization. So it allows for more automation. From AI autonomy, you get possibilities for automation. It allows for more dynamism because of the continuous learning capacity and adaptation. So you can have dynamic outputs. And it allows for new insights that humans are not able to reach, because these inscrutable methods are able to process very vast data that humans would not be able to process. So these are the affordances, the possibilities that come through fuzzy reasoning. On the other hand, fuzzy reasoning also comes with challenges or constraints. I found that AI developers, AI users, and AI managers, all in their way, lose control. They lose predictability, and they lose expertise as a result of this fuzzy reasoning and of these different specific AI characteristics. So on the one hand, you have affordances. On the other hand, you have constraints in terms of loss of control, loss of predictability, and loss of expertise. And there is this trade-off relationship between those affordances and constraints. The stronger the AI facets that you have, the stronger the autonomy, learning capacity, inscrutability, the stronger also the affordances and that you can benefit from, and the stronger the constraints that you need to face. And you need to decide as an organization what level of fuzziness you are willing to tolerate. And to deal with this, I observed how developers, users, and managers adopt different coping practices. Either they worked against fuzziness, so they constrained fuzziness by imposing some rules, for example, or they accept fuzziness and learn to work with it, work around it by having monitoring, for example, to identify when major problems emerge. Or they work from fuzziness, so they leverage it to their advantage and they use it to justify, for example, their own freedom and their own decision making or their own practices that they want to put through. And I found that these coping practices really emerged over time in the different communities of developers, users, and managers. And there was no specific coordination or general strategy regarding this fuzziness and how it should be dealt with. So more generally, this study helped me understand that AI not only makes work more efficient, but it actually introduces new unexpected complexities that need to be managed by all of the different stakeholders. And to manage AI well, you need a strategic coordination on what level of fuzziness you want to accept and understand the risks that come with this and how you cope with these across the organization. Now to my second empirical study and third study overall. There I focused on the second project where a machine learning model was developed and tested to predict the probability that a job seeker would become long-term unemployed. Like in most cases, Adam turned to AI for this to achieve better accuracy in such predictions and to compensate for human errors and human subjectivity. But given that AI models also make errors, they never perfectly predict what will happen with the job seeker because it depends on so many factors that the data and the AI model is not aware of. Then the focus turned to dealing with AI errors instead and in the best way. And here I asked the research question, how organizations design and organize for AI-based prediction errors. Based on my case, I found that by really unpacking AI errors and their consequences, and by putting together a multidisciplinary project team, you start to uncover how AI errors lead to different effects, different performativities, as you call it in research. In other words, AI predictions are not neutral representations of some reality, some objective reality, but the predictions, they shape the reality. Because when you do a prediction in algorithm, you trigger specific actions, like giving more or less employment support to a job seeker, depending on their risk level. You send signals with each prediction. A job seeker could be stigmatized in a certain way and treated differently, and thereby prolonging actually their unemployment. And predictions then interact with the reality that happens despite of the prediction. So, and if AI predictions are wrong, these performative dynamics and layers, they can have undesirable consequences for the organization and for individual job seekers. So by unpacking these different layers of consequences, the team here really started to understand that you cannot look at an AI accuracy metric in a general or theoretical way. You need to understand the different errors that can happen, like false positives, false negatives, and what consequences that they can have in your specific organizational context. And then you need to make choices on what is acceptable and what is not. like what errors are more or less acceptable, and where you want to place the right balance between them. And this is really a technical choice afterwards in the AI model, where you have parameters that you need to put in place to reflect this balance between the types of errors. In our case, by unpacking the errors, the team was able not just to adjust the design and parameters in the AI model to have an acceptable balance between types of errors, but also to put in place mitigating practices against each of these performative layers of errors. It also created a very interesting and positive dynamic of mutual learning between AI developers and AI users, because by making errors transparent and discussing them, the users started being engaged to understand how the AI model actually worked, why it would produce some errors, and where the weaknesses were that they, as humans, counselors, needed to compensate. And on the other hand, the AI developers were engaged to understand the context and how to optimize the model in a way that was really fitting to that context and to what was desirable for the users. So more generally, what I learned from this study was really how the management of AI goes beyond managing the performance of a technical system alone, like by looking at accuracy or KPIs only of the system or the process, but it's really about managing all of the performative dynamics that emerge across the organization when you introduce such a technology in the organizational context. Now, based on these three studies, what was the overall theoretical contribution of my doctoral dissertation? I was able to theoretically introduce what the practice of managing AI entails and what is specific about it and why it's worth studying further. Based on my research, I describe AI management as a practice of continuous alignment between managerial ambitions, such as augmentation targets, socio-technical design of AI systems, such as choosing the degree of fuzziness or trade-off between different types of errors, and organizational ripple effects, like the different consequences, for example, of AI errors. And to align these three elements, managing AI involves continuous work, including orientation practices, governance practices, and coping practices, which need to be distributed and aligned across different organizational groups. So that was more the theoretical contribution of my dissertation. Now I'll spend a bit more time on the practical contributions for AI managers or anyone involved really in managing AI indirectly. One first insight is that it's essential to clarify ambiguous objectives. AI is very multi-purpose, and generative AI even more now. And so the ambitions that can come with this technology can take very different forms. You can use it for productivity gains or getting new insights for better decision making, or creating new value, new service for customers, new markets to explore, or making the work of employees more meaningful. So there can be many ambitions pursued. And many organizations introduce AI with very broad ambitions like augmentation, often to contrast it with automation, which is perceived in a bit more negative way. And this dissertation shows that such vague terms of augmentation can hide actually a variety of different objectives. In practice, it means that different stakeholders may expect very different things from the same AI system that we start introducing to an organization. And managers should therefore invest time in explicitly articulating what AI is meant to improve for whom and what is required to reach these ambitions. And this also means that managing AI includes considering the relationships between, if you have multiple organizational ambitions, they might conflict with each other, they might depend on one another, and it's important to be aware of this whole system. These precisions of ambitions matter because they shape from the beginning how AI systems are designed, are evaluated, and are experienced afterwards in daily work. When you don't develop, but you purchase off-the-shelf solution, this means that it's important to foresee time and resources to fine-tune to the extent that's possible the AI models, the parameters, the interfaces, so that they really fit with the organizational values and the priorities, rather than forcing the organization to adapt completely to an off-the-shelf solution. Another implication is that managers of AI need to expect ripple effects. So AI systems, they rarely affect only the tasks that they were designed for. They introduce effects that travel across the organization. They are first-order effects. They correspond to the more obvious, expected, and intended changes in a business process, in tasks. So this is like what you first think about when you implement AI. You get improvements in efficiency or accuracy, for example. These are first-order effects. Second-order effects capture the more unintended and unexpected transformation that you get as a result of those first-order effects, and this could include like changes in the roles of some people, changes in routines, changes also in the identity that workers associate with their own work. And then finally, the third-order effects are deeper shifts in the structure of the organization. For example, implementing AI has been shown to reduce opportunities for on-the-job learning, especially young professionals joining the workforce. The more and more knowledge you embed in algorithms, the less opportunities there are to develop expertise. And so this completely reshapes how expertise is developed in professions and where we get the future experts that we still need in the different professions. Another example of such a third-order effect would be when you implement an LLM-based chat interface in an organization. We see that people tend to turn to these tools when they have questions and they ask the LLM rather than asking their colleagues. And so this reduces collaboration, it reduces knowledge exchange, and these are the types of unexpected ripple effects that you might get. So the reality, actually, when you implement AI might be very different from the ambitions that you had initially defined. Rather than being surprised by such effects, managers should expect them from the beginning, and they should create space to identify them and discuss them and surface them. And this includes regularly checking how AI outputs are really used in practice and whether they influence behaviors in some unintended ways. Managing AI, therefore, it means being attentive to these broader consequences and not just looking at the performance metrics within the specific process. It also includes freeing resources potentially to mitigate consequences that you don't want to have. Another insight is that managers of AI need to prepare for continuous alignment. So we know that the objectives of AI might shift over time. The AI technology, the models, the data, and therefore the outputs itself, they also change all the time. And our understanding of the consequences that emerge around it also involves. So this is all a moving system that needs to be managed. And it's really about continuously aligning the functioning of the technology, the work practices, and the organizational objectives and constraints. In traditional IT projects, we know that the complexity tends to decrease over time. In the beginning, there's a lot of vagueness and complexity, and then gradually the requirements of the system, they are specified in requirements documents, the solutions are developed based on these requirements, and so the complexity decreases. In AI projects, it's much more exploratory and iterative. It's very difficult to exactly define what the solution will do from the beginning. So there's a lot of playing around with the data, with different models, different parameters, and seeing what results come out and how they can be helpful. So the organizational implications, they remain very vague, and the governance around AI tends to become more complex over time rather than less. And despite this, I find that much of AI management currently focuses really on the early phases of design, implementation, and doesn't put much emphasis on the long-term management of AI in use. And this long-term management and governance, this needs specific resources as well. Then, of course, is that investments in machine learning, they need to be matched by investments in human and organizational learning. AI systems, they evolve as they are retrained and applied in new contexts. And to keep pace with this, organizations must create continuous learning opportunities for the people working with AI. So it's not just a formal training about the tool in the beginning, but it's also continuous learning on the job and learning from the AI system directly. So having AI as a teacher, basically. This is all what the concept of hybrid intelligence is about. And in this context, transparency of AI systems is very important, not just to have explainability and fairness, but also because transparency enables human learning. When users can understand how and why AI systems produce certain outputs and certain errors, they are better able to reflect on their own practices and to improve not just the AI, but also their own practices over time. So it's very important to have to make the AI systems as transparent as possible to facilitate this learning. Then another type of learning also happens between human developers and users. In the case at ADEM, we saw that the collaboration when it came to the design choices about errors really triggered a process of knowledge sharing and mutual learning where the users needed to learn about the AI logic, the strengths, the limitations, and the developers needed to learn about the work concepts and the practical consequences of their models. So this mutual learning didn't only help to make the algorithm more relevant for the organization, but also to bring the two groups basically together and work together. Then AI managers also need to accept that AI creates new work and complexity. AI is often presented as something that increases efficiency and makes human work easier. And this might and should be the case in a specific process where it's implemented. But what I learned again and again is that it will also make the work more complicated. Not necessarily for the people using the AI, but sometimes for management or for support staff around them. And my opinion is that the key value of AI compared to rule-based technology is not necessarily in efficiency gains, but it's really in creating new capabilities, new data processing capabilities that were previously just not feasible. And therefore, it gives us new insights and new services that can add value. The counter side of these new capabilities is that organizational processes, they become more complex rather than simpler when you introduce AI, and employees need to spend time interpreting the outputs, handling exceptions, managing uncertainty, explaining AI decisions to others, and this is additional work. So organizations therefore need to recognize that some additional roles and resources are probably necessary to scale AI in a successful and responsible way. And not just technical roles, not just developers, but also roles of AI governance, user support, and process re-engineering. Finally, the last point is that the research shows that managing AI effectively and responsibly, it requires a co-creation between technical experts, domain specialists, managers, support functions. So multidisciplinary collaboration is very important, and this is not a new insight. But from what I learned in the dissertation is that just assembling a multidisciplinary team, it's not enough. The difference is really made by actively coordinating, negotiating, and aligning the different perspectives that come from such teams. So managing AI, it includes creating a dialogue between different disciplines, valuing also different forms of expertise, and creating shared understanding and shared ambitions. And if I take the example on the study of fuzziness at ADEM, we saw that different organizational groups, more or less independently, they started developing coping practices with regards to fuzziness. So they started constraining or accepting or leveraging fuzziness. And while these coping practices made perfect sense for each group, they were not really coordinated and aligned actively between groups. So to go further in successfully managing AI, you can therefore have a common vision on what level of fuzziness you're willing to accept as an organization and how you intend to constrain or mitigate it together across the organization. Now, if I had to conclude in a few words on the learning of my doctoral dissertation, I think when we talk about managing AI, we often limit ourselves to these strategic frameworks that go from business objectives to use cases, organizational capabilities, and then implementation roadmaps, and this in quite a linear way. Through my research, I've come to understand that managing AI in practice is far more than having these one-off strategies or governance frameworks. It's really a very practical activity that's ongoing, it's complex, it's multidisciplinary, it changes from one organizational context to the next. This is what AI management is for me, more than drafting strategies. And so it requires you to continuously re-engage with the technology that's always changing and with the consequences that it triggers throughout your organization. And then take a lot of small iterative decisions to make it work for your context. This also means that as companies, but also as policymakers, we need to think beyond the initial design and implementation phases and plan for resources, financial resources and human resources for this continuous governance and managers that usually becomes more complex and resource intensive over time when with AI. And this can be a bit contrary to the hope that we will have very quick and very strong productivity effects when we implement AI. And this is my personal opinion and my personal conclusion from this dissertation. But I think when we approach it in this way, we might find that rather than focusing on quick incremental efficiency gains, the value of AI is much more in fundamentally re-questioning how we work and what added value we can create. So with this, thank you very much for listening to me and being interested in my research. And don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions, comments, or just like to discuss the research. Bye.